from our CNIL president and with Professor Jarvis and the background now that Giovanni has given us, we're going to jump right into some conversation. So Giovanni mentioned AI. Let me introduce, please, first our colleagues here. To my immediate right, we're delighted that Paul Nemitz, Principal Advisor, DG Justice and Consumers at the European Commission. Many of you know Paul from his many years of leadership on privacy and so forth, and more recently he is playing a lead role in helping shape the European Commission's actions on artificial intelligence. To his right, Adam Connor. Adam is just finishing up a year at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University. He's well known as, I think, the #1 Washington employee at Facebook many years ago. He then was at Slack. I'll ask him where he's going next because he seems to have this idea of which are going to be really the big things and knows how to see the future of technology. So I'm waiting and will invest in wherever he goes next. So Adam has some very useful views to share, having served both on the academic side and the industry side. Our colleagues in Israel very well likely know Dr. Tehilla Shwartz Altshuler, Senior Fellow at the Center for Democratic Values and Institutions of the Israel Democracy Institute, and also affiliated at Hebrew University. So look forward to her comments. And to the right, Jordana Cutler, the head of policy for Facebook Israel. Yes, great. Thank you for all of you. Let's jump right in. So AI is on the topic of everybody's debates. Paul, you've been playing a key role. The European Commission has put out a trusted AI strategy. Jeff talked about, well, China is going in one direction. The US, people think maybe is the Wild West, not well enough regulated. The EU feels perhaps that when it comes to platforms, global companies dominated, and since AI seems to be so critical, Europe must have a strategy to compete, to lead, but of course consistent with GDPR, a trusted AI strategy. What does that look like? Can the EU win and lead by showing us that AI must be reliable and trusted?
Well, I don't know whether we can win and lead, but we have put out a paper on 25th of April, which is the European Commission think piece for the time being, I would say, on artificial intelligence. And indeed, as you say, the first pillar of this is an industrial policy pillar, namely, let's invest in AI, let's do good research, let's make sure that it's something which is also tried and adopted by small and medium companies. So there is clearly a perception that this is very important and it will become all pervasive, and European business and competitiveness should be such that people and businesses benefit from this in Europe. And this is a little bit like GDPR. Many people forget that this was also an exercise of the internal market to benefit business. After all, the move from a directive to a regulation alone is a great gift to business, because, when you harmonize 28 laws into one law and you create a consistency mechanism, that reduces costs of business. And Article 1 of GDPR says free flow of data. And many people who have heated discussions about GDPR being an impediment to business, they just don't read the regulation properly. And so the same is true for artificial intelligence. I would say our first goal is, we want our researchers to research. There will be a lot of money invested in this, and businesses, to catch up. And yes, there is a perception that Europe has to catch up. So that's the first remark. But the second remark is, that I think, in contrast to the debate also which we have heard this morning, we are not biased in our view at what is important in the world. I think the perception in Europe is that now the main challenge is to invest in democracy and the rule of law. We have huge challenges in Europe in the rule of law. Borders are being stepped over, which haven't been stepped over in decades before. And we have huge challenges in the functioning of democracy. And so the most important question is not unreservedly, let's think first about what's good for the internet, or let's think first about what's good for AI. But I think the big challenge in Europe is democracy. How do we maintain it, and how do we maintain a rule of law and fundamental rights? And of course, when you come from this angle, the perspective on technology is a different one. There is, I would say, a legitimate thinking about, do we want to live in a world which is ruled by technology, where we are driven by technology, or do we want to live in a world where democracy primes? And this is about the basic question and the old question about primacy of democracy. And so therefore, also the AI communication, and maybe astonishingly, contains a chapter addressing these issues of rule of law, fundamental rights, and democracy, but also ethics. And why? Because if it is so that AI as technology, like the internet, becomes all-pervasive and basically takes decisions or prepares decisions, it becomes like a law. And therefore, the requirements towards AI to function in a society which is based on democracy, rule of law, and human rights must be like the requirements on the law. So to make it short, I think our effort will be to come to AI which, and to say it in one sentence, incorporates by design the principles of democracy, rule of law, and human rights, so that we have systems in the future which support our constitutional settlement, and not again an experience of technology which first follows a path of gotta break things if you want to move on, and let's roll out an excuse later. So I think this old attitude of disruption, which meant disrupting anything, including not paying taxes, not respecting copyright, not respecting democracy, not caring about fundamental rights, but creating a stalker economy, as Al Gore called it. I think this attitude, in a time when democracy and fundamental rights and rule of law are in a squeeze between this type of attitude towards technology and populism, has to end. So I think, yes, democracy has to learn from technologists and has to educate itself about the functioning of any technology, not just the internet. This has always been a challenge. Yes, but those who create technology also have to learn and relearn the imperatives of democracy, rule of law, and we need much more investment in technology impact assessment. We have to come back to taking long-term technology impact assessment serious. We have in Europe a network of parliamentary technology assessment, impact assessment. We need it on a political level. We need it on a company level. That's where ethics comes into play. The big debate about ethics is about company level impact assessment of new technology. And we need impact assessment on individual level, and that's where we come to the GDPR, which looks at the impact on the individual of personal data. So we need these three levels of impact assessment strengthened. And there we look to America too, because the Office of Technology Assessment in Congress was closed, I think, under Ronald Reagan. And business schools are teaching innovators and business leaders disruption is the most important thing. And that's how you make money. And disrupt anything and disrupt the law. This is what is taught in business school. This is why Uber just comes and starts, doesn't matter what the law is, we just go for it. And, this may have worked and may have been, considered, cool for some time. But populists also disrupt anything. And we have to see the interaction between this technology discourse and the rise of populism, whether in America, whether in Europe, whether elsewhere in the world. There is a relationship between both, and responsibility today, I would say, and I think that's probably the shared view in the college, and that's why in this communication on AI, there is such a big part on ethics and law. Responsibility today, also in business, means let's invest in democracy and rule of law and human rights first.
let's bring in Tehilla, who I know has been thinking and I think also writing about AI. Your thoughts on this topic?
Thank you. First of all, good morning. It's very nice to be here. So I could start talking about specific issues of AI, such as data and how to use data and the biases with the data. I could also elaborate a little bit of the need to reformulate the man and machine interrelationship. I could also touch on the black boxes issue and transparency. But I wanna talk about two things. I think that has to do with AI, but perhaps can provide a little bit of a wider context. I think, first of all, we need to expand the limits of our political imagination, because it's not enough to say that AI will have to adhere itself or be suitable to democratic values. We need to ask very honestly, what are the flaws in our democratic system, and in what ways can AI and other technological innovations improve our democracy, or maybe even alter it a little bit? Because when we talk about a society where AI systems make decisions for us, and we allow them to make those decisions, because after all, some of those decisions might be even better for us, it's much bigger than the rule of law. It has to do with free choice itself. And then we have to ask ourselves again whether our democracy is the suitable system for such an age. So don't misunderstand me. I come from the Israel Democracy Institute. I do not advocate here to go for some kind of an authoritarian regime, but I'm just saying it could go the other way around as well. And here I want to touch on another point, which I think is important. It's not often during history that two revolutions are taking place in such a short time. And if we talk about the connectivity revolution, the internet revolution, we have some lessons that we can learn about the relationship between government and industry and innovation itself. And I think the first thing that needs to be put here on the table, which is sometimes embarrassing but needs to be said, is the fact that most of the decision makers are digital ignorant, or I would say it a little bit more gently, they suffer from digital illiteracy. They are unfortunately on the wrong side of the revolution. And therefore, when you talk about the need to balance, let's say, innovation and democracy or human rights, they're not there. They're not even aware to the powers that influence the innovation process. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is the technological, I would say the journalistic coverage of technology. The journalistic coverage of technology suffers from schizophrenia, if you want, right? It's either very dystopic or very utopic, but it's never really in the middle. And unfortunately, decision makers get what they know from the press. And here again, we have, I think, a problem that we need to notice. I think that, let me just give you one short example. There's a double spread in one of Israel's leading economic newspapers this morning about a letter that one of our parliament members sent to the CEO of Facebook Israel, Google Israel, whatever, I think a few of them, why the CEO don't bother to come to discussions at the parliament. Which is, a very important issue. I would admit that sometimes it's not fun to be alone there, I can promise you, with the parliament members. But the fact that this kind of gets such a huge coverage without any material underneath means that our parliament members know that if they send one populistic letter, it is going to get full coverage. And this is a disaster if we want to talk about a serious discussion about technology. The last thing I want to mention is the fact that we need to pay attention to aspects of technology which are not or cannot be regulated as is. And with that, I mean specifically the behavioral aspect of technology or the psychological aspect of technology, because we can talk about privacy from here until tomorrow. But if you want to be very honest and you go out to a restaurant with your friends and they want to talk technology, they would take this machine and tell me, why the hell can I just not leave it alone? I'm addicted. We're talking about addictions. We're talking about the online disinhibition effect, which is actually the basis of every fake news or anything like that we talk about. We talk about anxieties and we talk about depressions. And if we want to be serious about AI or the future of AI, what is going to happen to us mentally if we are surrounded by sensors that are very, very human-like? And with that, I'm going to finish.
Adam, let me ask you, one of your tasks during your early days was teaching members of Congress how to use social media so they could get online, their staffs. Was your experience indeed that they were really technically challenged? I think there is some good news that the Office of Technology Assessment appears to be perhaps getting reinvigorated. We may see it back. But some have questioned whether we need an office, or is there a desire? Is it really the time? There are plenty of experts who will spend the time, but members are rushing around dealing with all sorts of global problems. Do they take the time to become expert enough? What was your experience? And add as well, now that you have had time to reflect, teaching on the academic side of your experience, do you think some of the issues that we've heard, platforms and companies having this great impact on democracy and technology, are these discussions that you see companies thinking about and taking seriously and recognizing their role, or are they sort of, no, my business is to provide my service, and that's not my challenge?
I think there's really kind of three parts of that discussion. I think the first is historic, which is, and certainly in my time at Facebook and in technology companies, was very much a time of convincing, of trying to say, we believe this is the future, and we're kind of trying to show you that. And as with any sort of kind of early adoption curve, there were people who were ahead of it, there were people kind of solidly in the middle, and there were people behind. And I think that is a pretty fair reflection of society itself. I joined Facebook when it was a website of less than 10 million people, and now it's certainly a website that is a lot larger. And so the discussions at the beginning were about the possibility of this future. And so I think sometimes when we look back on it and say, why weren't we convinced that we spent all this time thinking about all the dangers that would happen if this grew to 1 billion people, people didn't think it was going to grow that large, or they didn't have that belief at the time. And so I think some of these concerns need to move in concert with the size of the growth, and it's not realistic necessarily to ask a small startup to plan for the disruption of if you grow to 1 billion people. I think that these are things that have to go in concert. I think one of the things we know about policymakers is threefold. One is that some of them are going to be better at certain things than others. Some of them might have experiences in the military or in governing or in law, and technology is certainly something we'd like to see more of. I found generally that it was not an age piece, but more a comfort level piece. And so you had older members of Congress like John Dingell, who would stand in line for an iPhone release at 86 years old, and others who could be 25 and had, kind of were less comfortable with it. And generally, I would say as a rule of thumb, anybody who had served and survived a more competitive election process tended to be more in tune with new technologies in the midst of their own self-interest of getting reelected or staying in office. So that kind of need to stay relevant was important to stay in office. I think the third piece as we look forward, and a lot of people look at the testimony in Congress and some of the questions that we see from legislative bodies as an endpoint, as we see this as ignorance, and obviously this is the thing where it ends. And I think it's pretty clear to me, having lived in Washington now for a long time, that this is the start of a discussion, that this is the beginning of something that tech is going to be getting a lot of questions on. And I think the industry as a whole should probably be embracing these questions, these scrutiny, more than it is being defensive about it. I like to tell my students when I was at Harvard that most industries don't get to be have a lot of power, have a lot of money, be unregulated, and be popular. generally you can pick 2 of those at most, and you should be prepared for a world where you don't get to have all 4. And I think tech got a little too used to being all 4, having a lot of money and power, being popular, and being unregulated, and that's probably not the future we're going to see. And so I think what we're going to see is more informed scrutiny and criticism, and I think to Jeff's point and some of these other points, which is we're not sure of the right path here. I think it is important to have these robust discussions, because without them, you are more likely to see, I think, bad legislation or bad regulation, and I think that a pursuit of a broader discussion on this is really important. I think tech companies bear some of the blame here. They have been, on one hand, saying, this is too complicated for you to possibly understand, and with the other hand, saying, well, we're not going to give you any information to understand it. And that's an attitude that might have worked in the past, but might work in the future, but is more likely to lead to bad outcomes than it has in the past. So I think what we are entering on is really, I think, spurned by GDPR and some other pieces, a period of more intense scrutiny and formulation. And I imagine many of the people in this room will be playing leading roles in that. And in the next few years of that are really going to determine the course, both from regulators and companies, on how that gets settled. And I think the danger, certainly for big tech in particular, is the strategy of that has led them to this point will work until it doesn't, and then might end up in an outcome that they might be unhappy with. So I think there's a lot of period right now where we are going to be looking a lot at this and having broader discussions that will be very valuable. But I think everyone, from the companies to the regulators to the elected officials, are aware this conversation is coming. I think no one here can say that when this comes, it will be a surprise at this point.
So, Jordana, platforms, content online, clearly supported by ads, clearly 20 years probably already of debating how, where, why do consumers understand. During some of the hearings, it seemed like some of the policymakers were wondering and being surprised about exactly, how it worked. What's your, thinking? Clearly, Facebook sees personalized advertising as part of the mission, right? Connecting community and personalized advertising as a core piece of the equation. What are the kinds of things we should be expecting, thinking, either at Facebook or the industry-wide, that help sort of move this conversation along of how advertising can be personalized, relevant, transparent, sort of desired? There's obviously been a lot of changes made by lots in the industry. Your thoughts on this sort of ongoing debate, which I'd like to finish before my 2 times high anniversary, and maybe we can move on to other challenges. But
first of all, I just want to thank Jules and Omer for having me. I'm a second timer here at this conference, so thank you for having me back. I appreciate being here at the table and being a part of this discussion. So it's a very broad topic. What I think the most productive way to narrow it, at least for my opening remarks, is to focus on the issue of transparency. And that hits a lot of the different aspects of the development of where we're going as a policy team at Facebook. So we can look at that obviously in terms of transparency in community standards. What does that mean, what you're allowed and not allowed to do on Facebook? We took a big step a month ago to launch what we called our comprehensive community standards so that people have much more detail. I encourage you all to read all 27 pages of what is actually allowed and not allowed on Facebook. We thought it was very important that people have the transparency to understand how we look at content and make those decisions. Another element of transparency would be focused on advertising, as you mentioned, Jules. So one of those is to give people the power to really understand what information they've shared, what they have to, do in order to control their information in the best possible way. People have the ability within our settings to have a lot more control than they realize. This is one of the things that I love getting to do about my job in many different public forums, is trying to raise awareness to people that they have a lot of options within Facebook to decide what they want to share. And that is not only in terms of sharing what content you want to share with friends or family or colleagues, but also in terms of advertisers. You can go in and see all the different advertisers that have been targeting you. You can decide to delete them. You can delete data. We've released a new function called Clear Your History. You can just go in and clear things out. We really want people to have control, and that transparency is something that's really important for us in terms of advertising. And lastly, in terms of political advertising, we think that it's really important to give people the power to understand what they're seeing and where it comes from. And that's why we've just launched in the US, and it will launch out globally, more transparency in terms of advertising. You'll be able to click on a feature that says view all ads and see where this advertiser is advertising other information. So if they're running an ad that you've seen in your newsfeed, you can see what are the other ads. You can see where the admins are located in what countries. And we think that this kind of ability of the user to understand what they're sharing, what they're seeing, and where it's coming from is going to make people's overall experience much better on Facebook.
So opening comment, everybody gets to answer with some loquacious, but now we're going to go quick lightning talk, and I'll jump in a little bit to see if we can actually have a little bit of a conversation the way we would do so. But first, a little comment. My kids are big Snapchatters, and we had a very big problem this year. You know, you have to have a streak on Snapchat with your friends, right? Every day you say something, and then you get credit that you're continuing the streak. So it's very maybe addictive or very compelling. And if you lose your streak, it's like a terrible thing. So, but the Chag of Rosh Hashanah this year, I think, came out right next to Shabbat, 3 days. And my kids know they're not supposed to be on their phone 3 days. So what they usually do, Friday night.
Detox, by the way.
It's Friday night, right before sundown, they quickly get on their phone, streak. My son is 16, he doesn't have a lot to say, he just sends a blank screen. It's like, just like, hey, right? It's okay. It's fine. No, and I mention this because this is how we all need to forget about the technology. We need to understand the human, integration of this. And then right after Shabbat, sundown, boop, 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 they all get on and they keep their streak. 3 days, I could see them stressing as the holiday came up, all right? And I said, listen, my son says, no, it's okay, no problem. After the holiday, I said, okay, you're okay? He says, oh no, I worked it out. So what do you mean you went on the phone all these years of education and you are, he says, I shared my password with my friend and he went on and he did the streak for me. I'm like, how many years are you living with somebody who's working on privacy and you instead, he says, what was worse, that I gave my password or that I should violate the Chag? All right, so I raise it because this younger generation obviously is growing up. We debate, do they care about privacy? How much do they care? I know they care about privacy from me very much. They seem a little less, a little more cynical. They say, I don't pay attention to the ads, so why do I care? But are we as parents, does anyone know what a Finsta is here? You know what a Finsta is? I just learned what a Finsta is. Omer, I see your feet. Okay. So I said to my daughter, I saw your friend. She didn't have too many pictures, just a few very official ones. Doesn't she use Snapchat? My daughter says, that's her Finsta. I said, what? Finsta? It's like a new word. Fake Insta, as opposed to the real one that she shares with her friends. So beware, you have to look out for the Finsta. But what impact, GDPR adjusts the age of consent, 16, some countries are departing down, parents are sharenting, a new word I also learned, sharing more information about their kids. I saw some statistic that unborn children already have detailed information because parents are sharing the sonogram, and so when you're born, you already have a profile of the party, and then sometimes the delivery, right? So what impact are we thinking about, the impact on society and on children? We have AI-powered dolls. What thinking is happening, and I share this for any of you who will jump in. Does the age of consent solve this? Clearly, that's only one piece of the question. Who's got something to kind of educate us on the younger generation? Paul, and I see Tehilla, and keep them tight because we'll go. And Jordan, I think, looked like she's going to say something.
I'm qualified to answer because I have two sons, 12 and 14, and know all these issues.
Are they on Snapchat?
Yes, they are. But I don't think these issues are funny. I don't think they are love. I think society, first of all, has a huge responsibility. Of course, parents too. But to leave it all in the hands of the individual is overcharging the individual because the programming takes in part place in such a way that people become addicted intentionally. And, I think society here has an important role to play, and I don't agree with the statement that we cannot regulate psychology. I mean, yeah, that statement is correct. But we can do regulation against dependency. For example, the French project of President Macron to say no mobile phones in school until senior high school grade, I think it is something worth thinking about, because this is not a laughing issue. Because what we're creating here is tech dependency, and we're handing over our children to these companies, and we create autists, and they don't talk with each other anymore. The participation in soccer has been 52% of our youngsters until 2013, when the smartphone took off. Since then, it's declining. Now we have 20% participation in soccer. And it's not only about soccer, it's about all sports. So what tech does, and this is an important message, it's not all just great and good and, oh yeah, super, and we laugh about the idiots who don't understand tech. There are many people in tech who don't understand democracy, who are not engaging in democracy, and who don't understand what they're doing to our children. So, I also have an issue with the talking down of democratic politics from an arrogant, you don't understand tech. Well, what is the democratic engagement of Facebook? How did that come about with Cambridge Analytica? There are many people in tech who have an arrogant way of talking about democracy, and not only arrogant, who are in some places anti-democracy. Because if you go around and say the internet must be free of regulation, if the internet becomes the all-encompassing infrastructure, if artificial intelligence becomes all-pervasive, well, what does that mean for democracy if you say it cannot be touched by the rule maker? And I liked what you said about growing up. The difference when we now face artificial intelligence to the time when the internet was in infancy, it's exactly what you described. It may well have been right at the time to say, let them do, only 10 million people, there's great potential, and. But now, when we look at AI, it's not infancy we're looking at. We're looking at hugely powerful corporations which have exactly the 4 factors which you said, and they are the big developers of AI. And therefore we cannot relax and say, oh, let's take our time, Gutenberg 150 years. No, there are very big questions of democracy at stake here. And honestly, we are at the brink in many countries. And it has to do something with technology. It has to do something, for example, with the fact that on this little screen, the populist message, the parliamentarians know nothing about technology, they are idiots, that fits on the screen. But the elaborate answer of how to do a societal policy for internet, it doesn't fit on the screen. So the internet creates a bias for populists. And you can see it when you look at participation rates. If you look at the parties which are best organized in the tech field, it's the populists. It's in Germany, the AfD.
Well, let's bring in the others.
Last sentence. No, but I just, because we have this, we have the laughing in the audience, and about the technology, the democratic electors who know nothing and so on. Sorry, that's my last point. The individualistic streak of the tech scene, whether from companies or from civil society, where people think that they just have to develop the right code and download the right program and just get it right with AI, and then all societal problems will be solved, and also my individual problems will be solved. That is a huge mistake. I think we have to teach the technology scene that this misguided individualism, that leads to populism. We have to invest in democracy, and that means also we have to respect the fact that lawmakers make laws which also touch this technology and also the internet.
I think it's more than reasonable to say that we should be having these discussions. I think that's right. I think it is important. I've been a democracy organizer for my entire life. I've been a digital and political organizer my entire adult life. I think that one of the things that gets ignored in particularly this modern context of internet and participation is the decrying of populism and other pieces, which I think are critical roles. But these are things that the more people being involved with technology are empowering. And while the results are not always we want, this is a form of democracy. And so I think it is important to separate what we would aspire and hope our democracy to be from pure participation and how we may think of some of those effects as negative. Some people may think the increase of people to share their voices, which are, I think, occasionally disproportionately negative to some of the values we've held, is a byproduct of more people having access to technology. I think it's a worthy debate. I think when we say democracy, though, sometimes we say it as if we mean the system that has existed and not necessarily the participation of people, which can go in many different directions. And it is important and incumbent on us to put those guardrails upon that participation in a society that we want to reflect in our values, our lives. But the pure participation aspect is separate from where we guide those values. And I think that's where the discussion goes. I think one of the things I just say when it comes to the kids, having just spent a couple of months with the students, we had a visit from the Parkland students in Florida after the shooting there. And one of the things that was, I think, hopeful for all of their digital addiction and their importance of streaks is it didn't take somebody to tell them that what they needed to do to organize a movement was they had to wait. What they were able to do is log on to a Google Doc. They were able to send an email. They were able to use Snapchat, and actually they had to use Instagram to organize because Snapchat disappearing is not the correct mechanism for organizing things. We need people to show up. But what was just very interesting, what I noticed is while we look at these things and remember the world as it was, the people who have grown up in there, I think it is important. We have to worry about psychology, you have to worry about this, but they've grown up as digital natives and digital organizers as well. And so they are able to harness this system in ways we haven't necessarily anticipated. And so I think while these are worthy discussions and we should definitely have them, we should keep both of those perspectives in mind.
Tehilla.
Okay, so I think the first thing that needs to be said here is that there's a little bit of a paradox here because when we feel that the biggest companies are harming reality, society, our children, whatever you want to do, you want to call it, we go to the government to save us. But governments also are not indifferent to technological advances, and they use them in order to cope with political dissidents, in order to create more surveillance around the cities, and so on and so forth. So we shouldn't remember, we shouldn't forget that governments are harmful to our human rights, sometimes not less than the big companies, before we go and see them as our biggest saviors. But so that's the first comment. I want to elaborate on the GDPR and our personal control as a cure to privacy issues. I can say one thing. I really was so surprised, at least in the Israeli press and also in the American one, where which I consume. Think about this boring directive with so many paragraphs becoming like news. Who would believe that? This is really interesting, but the truth is that seeing the GDPR, which is with its my personal control over my personal information, perception as the cure to everything, is really far from reality. Because if you look at behavioral economics, you know that it's not going to work. We're not going to read the terms of services. We're going to continue clicking because it's fun and it's free, and that's how we're programmed to act. And here I want to say about human rights something which I think is important. The right to privacy is following in the steps of her older sister, which is the right to free press. They're both, I think, a prior condition to conducting a proper democratic process. And the right to freedom of the press started as a very private personal right, something that allows me to just stand in the corner of the street and shout my ideas out, whatever. It took us a while to understand that it should have a more of a collective aspect, which is what we call a pluralistic public sphere. The right to have pluralism and Habermas and the public sphere and so on and so forth. I think the same thing goes with the right to privacy. The, I would say, personal or private aspect of privacy is the control, is the GDPR. but it's far from enough. And what we need to look at now is the autonomy traps, the ability to build behavioral psychological profiles of ourselves and then retarget them with messages that are tailor-made towards us or for us. There's no need to assume that this is going to stop with consumerism and selling us product. It is going to happen during election times. It is going to happen with ideas and with beliefs. And when we talk about this, it is a totally different area of regulation than GDPR. It has to do with propaganda laws. It has to do with antitrust laws. For instance, there's a story now going on in Israel. One of the, there was a reform in the banking industry, forcing the banks to sell credit cards companies that they owned. Now, one of the credit cards companies is going to be bought by one of the internet providers, service providers, one of Israel's internet service providers, and who also supplies multi-channel television. And you think to yourself, what exactly is going to happen here? It is going to create a huge personal data company, but nobody's looking at it from this angle. That's, I think, the thing. And also, I spoke before about the psychological aspects. I don't think they can't be regulated. I think we need to understand that the core of the issue is the behavioral aspect. And we don't need to regulate stuff which is populist. We need to think about the core issues. And in this sense, I think the core issue is the right to be left alone, the traditional right to be left alone, which can cause a lot of psychological harm in the future if we allow people to be in the presence of sensors and machines which monitor them 24/7.
So one of the core issues around regulation is the right way to deal with content, terror, hate speech online. Clearly, we're seeing some tensions between very strong regulatory penalties. I managed the content moderation teams for many years at AOL, and we were very conservative. If maybe it was possibly illegal, possibly offensive, we took it down. And it was really hard and complicated. We used to not allow certain terms that were pejorative. Dyke, for instance. And then we got complaints. Wait a second, this is how I present myself. Kike. Wait, there's a group now called Kikes on Bikes. They're Jews who ride bicycles. They're very proud. And we weren't allowing these terms, and then people were offending. So I said, okay, I'm going to update the policy. You can use this term if it appears to be used in a positive, self-referential manner. And I sent the policy out to the moderators all over the world, in India, in the Philippines, in Israel. And you can imagine chaos, because to make these assessments, you needed to read paragraphs and paragraphs. And if you're sitting all day and you're looking at content, and I say, by the way, in the Philippines, it's not okay to use this term. And in social, so it seems to be one of the areas where last year, Commissioner Jourova spoke and talked about generally the European approach here, supporting, recognizing the balancing with free speech, a self-regulatory model. Since then, Germany obviously came in with a regulatory model. This is an issue certainly being debated in Israel. Jordana, your thoughts on this sort of challenge of balancing free speech, content, and then the hand.
If you will allow me, though, I would like to mention your teenagers briefly.
Please.
On the online for youth. And I'm happy to answer the second one. I just wanted to note that I think it's really important that we look at not any technology as good or bad, but how we use it. This is something that we spend a lot of time at Facebook to understand how we can help to improve online well-being, look at addiction issues. It's something that we look at in a multifaceted way. I, for example, have 3 children who, because of technology, have very close relationships with 4 grandparents and 4 great-grandparents 5,000 miles away. And that's something that I, as a parent of young children, monitor. I think it's an issue that we have to help parents and families and organizations who are really deeply involved in these issues, which is why next week actually we're sponsoring a conference here in Israel specifically on online youth well-being. It's very important to us. We're working with an organization called Ashnav, which is very active in this issue here in Israel. I think it's a matter of looking at building products that are appropriate. So for example, we've launched Messenger Kids in the US and now a few other countries, which is products that are more aimed at helping parents deal with this problem with their kids. And so whether it's helping to fund research or to be involved with people on the ground, again, a lot of these are local solutions, right? Kids in Germany and France and the US and Israel are all going to relate to these issues very differently, and so will their parents. And so that's why we are locally invested in these issues on the ground to make sure that we are helping find the right solutions. On the second issue about content moderation, as I mentioned in my comments earlier, last month we released our comprehensive community standards. We felt that it was really important for people to understand the nitty-gritty nuances of how we were looking at issues, whether it's nudity or hate speech or spam or credible violence. And so we wanted to give people as much information as possible on that. And as you mentioned, Jules, in your experience at AOL, there needs to be humans looking at this content. We're doing our best to figure out the balance between technology and human review, but when it comes to very nuanced subjects, we believe that technology is not at the place to make some of the tough decisions, which is why we are going to have by the end of the year almost 20,000 people reviewing content at Facebook. We think that slowly we are able to use technology more, mainly on issues like fake accounts, spam. We are slowly starting to do this on hate speech in very small markets, in a small number of markets like the United States, I believe also in Portuguese. But again, we really believe that we need bigger data sets and we need to give more time for technology to learn how to make these decisions, which is why we're investing in humans at the time being.
What about fake news, Jordan? And then maybe let me ask the others, but briefly to comment in so we can get some of the perspectives. In many countries, we're seeing prime ministers, presidents calling news they don't like fake news. We see it in the US, we see it in Israel, we see it in other places. And all of us who've read a story, maybe about Israel, maybe about an issue that we know a lot about, and you say, well, this reporter, clearly fake news. They had an agenda and it was biased. How do we look to platforms or better models of journalism? Where do we go with the fact that this painful issue of fake news? Do we want companies, having a trust barometer? What's the path forward on this really complex issue? Like Jordan, and let me ask the others.
We think it's really important to distinguish that the majority of what we're calling fake news is attempts to commercially attack people to make money. So clickbait, for example. So there's a lot of spam and clickbait, which is the majority of what we say is fake news. So I think the interesting part of the discussion, what you're aiming at, is more politically motivated fake news. And I'm sure that you've heard people from Facebook say before, and will continue to say it, that we do not believe we should be the arbiter of the truth. You mentioned presidents and prime ministers and world leaders calling news stories fake news, and we do not want to be in the position where we're coming in and deciding if content can or cannot be on Facebook, if it's truthful or not truthful. What we can do to try to attack this problem is, for example, downrank news that has been flagged to us as fake by people. So we're starting to work more with third-party fact checkers, seeing how that's working, seeing how reports from people in the community saying things to us are fake news, and trying to let people see less of content that they believe is what they call fake news. Another thing, for example, is working hard to make sure that there's no foreign interference. A lot of what this fake news discussion heads into those kind of discussions, and that those are issues that we work on closely with governments. We're already here in Israel preparing for municipal elections, which will happen in the end of October. It's something very important to us. It's on our radar. And obviously, whenever the national elections will be scheduled for, I think, the end of 2019, whenever they'll be, it's an issue that we work closely with local authorities to make sure that issues like this aren't affecting anything in the political process.
Okay, real brief. Paul, fake news?
Yes. Well, I think one has to really make a big line. It's a completely different issue whether you discuss, terrorism, hate speech, anti-Semitism on the internet. On the one hand, illegal content, namely, at least under European law, and on the other hand, fake news. Fake news is a much more difficult issue. But I would say, on the impact of technology, and Jeff, I think he made a very impressive statement. He said, look, we've created monsters which now have led to only 30,000 journalists, or less than 30,000 journalists in the US, while one company only has 20,000 people hunting dirty stuff on the internet. Wow. That is the impact of technology, because 80% of the advertising revenue, which previously went to the fourth estate and the press, which had a democratic function, now goes to two companies in the United States and Europe too, Facebook and Google. And now we have all these repair exercises. We have to repair this, we have to repair that, and so on. So, I think it's good that the companies own up to that, but I would say politics, and not governments only, but parliaments also, have a role in this.
Let me bring in Adam and Tehilla, because...
Let me just, one remark on, the companies. I always hear community rules. I have negotiated the code of conduct against hate speech and incitement to violence on the internet with Facebook, Google, Twitter, and so on. The code of conduct, that's fine, that's your private business thing. But what is important is that you obey our laws. And it took a long time to get the companies to commit that they do obey the law in Europe and in Germany, and Israel should also ask for that. These companies are not above the law. This constant talk about our community rules and so on, that's John Perry Barlow, 1996, the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. There is no law of parliament which touches us, we regulate ourselves. No. I have no problem with your community rules.
I'm sorry, but we have a transparency report.
You have to obey the laws. You have to pay taxes, and if we have laws which say anti-Semitism and swastika is forbidden, then you have to make sure that this happens, yes? And, that's democracy.
I completely agree with you, which is why we have a transparency report, which demonstrates per country all the material that we've removed, which is illegal locally in every country in the world that didn't meet the criteria of our community standards. So again, and I've said this on the record in the Knesset, that we respect local law. When there's a difference between our community standards in Israel and Israeli local law, we remove that content and we publicize it on our transparency report.
Good.
Quick last thoughts, Tehilla, Adam?
I would just make 2 points, one of which is the phrase fake news, I think has, and if we could go back in time, I think the people that originated that post-2016 would pick a different phrase. The mis and disinformation phrase, I think, is a more accurate description of various types, and I point you to the Shwartz Center's report and actually the European Commission's report on mis and disinformation as a good primer for that discussion. I think Jeff would probably have other resources. I think the other point would just be, I think, a reminder of what my panelists here said, which is that governments are not always a force for good in these institutions. I think when Jordana mentions a transparency report, these are requests, lawful requests by government to remove content that you might find questionable in that country, but you might also object to here. And I would remember that there are plenty of examples of government requests for takedown from governments that you might not be motivated by the same kind of rule of law or democracy standards that we see. And so the balancing act is tough. I would certainly even point you to countries like Australia, Turkey, and others, which force these companies to make, I think, choices that are distasteful. And I think to the extent that this conversation happens with US-based companies that at least have a basis in law for a freedom of speech and freedom of press, it is probably in this instance better that the American companies have this perspective than it would if they were some other one. So I think it's certainly a perspective that's unlike other places in this world. In America, the basis of law, particularly around speech and press and its institutions there, are something that I think will likely influence these discussions in a way as we have them globally for both good and bad.
I'll close with the final word that is certainly... Oh, I'm sorry, Tehilla.
Okay, I'll be very quick.
No, go ahead.
That's fine. I want to say something about fake news. Fake news is a notion that has been contaminated by our prime minister, maybe the American president, and I think that the public understand now that there's a principal agent problem here with both the president and our prime minister. They don't use this term in order to improve either traditional or social media ethics, but rather to improve their political situation. So if we talk about disinformation, as you have mentioned before, it is quite bothering to read an article in Science or in any other respectful magazine saying that fake news penetrates deeper into the network or spreads faster than the truth. It seems like a time when the truth is limping after all those disinformation and misinformation. Having said that, it's not that we were that successful in regulating media in the traditional world. And it's not a coincidence that our Prime Minister is facing criminal charges for deeds that had to do with his relationship with media companies' owners and so on and so forth. The question of how to draw the line is a very delicate one. I wouldn't go and say, very, very surely and clearly that we need to regulate content online. I'll just say one more thing. We have now in Israel a whole debate about the new cyber law, which will give the government a lot of power to regulate infrastructures in order to prevent cyber attacks. Our non-tangible cyber attacks, which are meant to harm, let's say, public opinion and stuff like that, should be regulated the same way? I'm afraid not. I don't think I want security agencies to put their hands into this. But once we say that fake news has the same power as, let's say, a practical attack, this is what we are heading for. And this is going to be something that we need to be prepared for, and I'm not happy with that. Thank you.
I'll just close with the final thought that I think, maybe with some exceptions at outlying companies, most have moved beyond the debate that law doesn't cover them, a la John Perley Barlow. The big question is, at least in the Western democracies, who determines whether something violates the law? The free speech advocates, maybe some of the companies, certainly I argue a judge, a transparent process, let's have case law, let's litigate it. The other side maybe wants to...
Forgot the machine.
The machine. The other side maybe wants to show up and say, no, I'm critiquing the content, that's why it's there. Or should it be automated? Should it be the company determining first, maybe being cautious because they don't want penalties? That healthy debate that we're seeing, Paul, I'd argue, is the kind of debate we want, because it's who decides which law, and do we see it publicly, or do we have it, as we see in some countries around the world, quietly happening because the government sends a message? So we're not going to solve it today, but it's a critical debate, and I thank the audience and the panelists here for giving us some real sense. Thank you.